In this video, we will introduce the museum project. So this class doesn't have a final exam because it's not primarily a content class, and a lot of what content there is aimed at helping you make a deliverable project, which would be this museum project, right? So this is the important thing. Hundreds of points will be building up to this, and the assignment itself is worth 200 points. So this is very important, and it's something we're going to be working throughout, and I want you to keep in mind so that you can do your very best and make a project that you will be proud of at the end of this class, and something that hopefully later on, in fact, you could brag about during, say, a job interview or in a application to graduate school. So this is a big project. But I'm going to try and do as much as I can to help prepare you for it. There'll be various videos and readings that will be assigned throughout class that will help you to do a better job, to do your very best to be prepared for this. And there will be also assignments on which I will give comments that will help you to develop your ideas. So the first, of course, is the museum exhibit critique paper. That is worth 50 points due week 1. There's also 2 reports in which you will be asked to answer certain questions about the project you're thinking about, and that will give me the opportunity to say, hey, that's a great idea, keep going with it, or, oh, wait a second, that may not work for these reasons. It's also necessary for your research, for your museum project, that you do research, that you learn stuff about what you're going to exhibit about, right? So you're going to make an exhibition, basically, kind of a model project of one, and you need to learn stuff. So there's a museum secondary source report, in which you'll tell me what you've learned, and a museum primary source report. Primary sources are the heart of a history, so you need to at least look at one. I will expect you to include that in your exhibit. And in addition, the museum project itself is worth 200 points, right? So you've got these assignments building up to it, and in the project itself, worth 200 points. So what all does the museum project involve? Well, that's what this video is going to be talking about. So first of all, for this assignment, you will design an exhibit based on a certain theme and time period as if it was to be displayed at a local museum. All right, so you're going to make basically your own exhibit. Your project will consist of the following parts, right? And the first part is a written proposal, right? That's worth 75 of the 200 points. And it has to include the following. Right, you need to say the time period, and it should not exceed more than 10 years. This is only an exhibit, so you can't do, travel through the 20th century. That would be far, far too much to do. So it shouldn't be more than 10 years, so you can stay adequately focused. It needs to state the place. That should not be larger than a county, because again, it needs to be focused. You can't do, for example, the Civil War. Of course, that would work for the time period because it's less than 10 years, but it doesn't work for the place, right? Now, looking at how Greenwood was affected by the Civil War, that would be a starter, but not quite enough. You would need a theme, and some themes that people have done in the past would be like things like looking at children's games. You could look at medicine at the Battle of Gettysburg, something like that. But the theme has to also be narrow. So, even the Battle of, the Civil War in Greenwood, you need a theme that you would talk about, such as children in the Civil War in Greenwood, or how that affected farming or something like that, right? And you also need to explain to me why you've chosen that particular time period, place, and theme. You also need an exhibit title that conveys your big idea, right? By big idea here, I don't mean, hey, what's the big idea? I mean, okay, what's your overall big point, right? That you're trying to make, and you need an exhibit title, right? So this is something that people are going to read and hopefully be inspired by and say, hey, that sounds like a really cool exhibit. I want to see that, right? And it has to adequately convey your big idea. You also need a clear thesis statement, right? And we'll talk more about what thesis statements are. But the key thing is that you need to be arguing something, and it needs to be clear from in your exhibit what it is that you're going to be arguing, right? So this is what happened to farming during the Civil War in Greenwood County, for example. You would need to state that very clearly, right? You also need at least 3 descriptive captions that provide evidence for your thesis statement. And one of these can be your primary source. But, if you go into a museum, right, you see lots of different captions. You see, descriptions of of pictures, and you sometimes just see writing, that's what I'm talking about. You'd have at least 3 descriptive captions that are going to give the evidence for your thesis statement. So it's kind of like writing a paper, but in a more visual format. So continuing on, and one thing I want to point out, you should print this out. This is available on Blackboard. This description of this assignment's totally available on Blackboard. You don't just have to rely on this video. So you should print it out and have it available. You would also need descriptions of at least 5 items that will make up your exhibit, an explanation of why those items should be a part of it and how they support your thesis statement. And each of the description explanation should be at least 100 words long, and the source where the item could be obtained. If it is a website, be sure to include the address, right? So, when you go to an exhibit, we'll talk more about this later. One thing that's so cool about museums, it's not just writing. They have actual stuff, right? And your exhibit should include stuff. Now, you're probably not going to be able to, I had someone once who did their project was based on artillery at a local battle, and you probably won't be able to get a cannon, but you could include a picture, and that will work for this one. At least one of these items must be a primary source document. Now, these explanations are not for the visitors. It's for me to understand what your exhibit is about. You would also include captions for those 5 items, and these would actually be what the visitors themselves would read, and each of those captions should be no more than 25 words long. And I want to emphasize that, right? If you're a visitor at a museum, and we'll talk more about making good exhibits later, you're going to be turned off if there's a whole bunch of text, especially because there's so much text they have to put it in a small font. So you need to really be succinct. You need to be really clear, right? And I'm going to, again, be strict on that, making sure that you're below the word limit. So keep that in mind, that your captions stay at no more than 25 words long. Now, G is one thing that makes, I think, museum exhibits so cool, and it's something you don't really think about with like a paper. But how will you utilize light, sound, and space to enhance the experience of your exhibit, right? Those are things that, again, you don't really do with papers, but you have to consider with a museum. So, for example, I had a student who really made a really cool plan for an exhibit based around Dr. Martin Luther King, and in which she had, I guess, found out that there were recordings of some songs that he had sung along with, and so she said she was going to have that a looped music of those songs playing softly in the background. So that's kind of cool. Sometimes people will use lots of light and darkness to emphasize different aspects. If you're going to do something on the history of the environment, you may want to have green light or brown light to emphasize kind of earthiness. The student who I just mentioned who did the civil rights or the exhibit on Dr. Martin Luther King that was so cool, she had the exhibit designed in a way so that space would flow around so that you would be directed in a certain direction. And she even had like places, she had pews. She wanted to have pews put up like in a church, and she was going to make the exhibit look like one of the churches he had preached at. So it's really cool. And so you can let your mind go wild because you won't actually build this thing, but you will have to diagram it. And then finally, what museum your proposed exhibit would ideally be displayed at, and what audience and why it is appropriate for that venue and audience. So you need to, one big thing with, we talked about in another video, was that you're going to be talking to a diversity of people. Why is it appropriate, this exhibit appropriate for those people? And which museum do you think would be best for your exhibit? So the next 3 items are a little bit more simple. One, the second item worth 25 points is a single sheet poster with photos aimed at the potential audience advertising the exhibit and its grand opening, right? So, museums have to advertise. They have to tell people, hey, this is something you should come see. So you have to kind of do that yourself, and you have to do this with just a single sheet, right? Because that's how big a poster is. I need to include some photos that you think will attract their attention. This sheet should be uploaded onto Blackboard as a doc, docx, JPEG, or PDF document. The third item, also worth 25 points, is a plan for a grand opening party that will raise community interest in the exhibit and attract the attention of potential donors to the museum. You got to make your donors happy. You got to bring in new donors if you want to keep having a museum. Museums oftentimes do not get enough funding from the government or admissions to continue to exist. They need donors. Your plan should be at least 500 words in length. And like I said, that's worth 25 points. The last one is you should have a photograph of your exhibit on poster board of high enough quality that I can make out the details, right? I don't have to actually be able to read the captions because you're going to give those to me, but I got to see how you're laying out things, how you do the fonts and all that stuff. And that you could just do like a science fair exhibit where you have that piece of poster board that folds in 3 ways so it can stand up. Or you can have a diagram of what your exhibit will look like. And so for the example, that woman who wanted to do this, Dr. Martin Luther King, she couldn't really do that on a single piece of cardboard. So she produced a very nice diagram that would show what her exhibit would look like. But the key thing is I need to see how all the items in one, the thesis statement, the big idea, the captions, all those things, I need to see how those will be laid out. And don't worry, if you're a little bit confused by that, don't worry, we're going to talk more about that as time goes on, how those kind of things go together. But that is something you need to think about. So you have the option. You can either make the poster board and then send me a picture, or you can make a diagram of what your exhibit will look like. And that's better if you're thinking of something like really complex, like what she did with the pews and the music and so forth. However, whatever option is pursued, it must be done in a professional manner. It's got to look like something that you would be comfortable showing to, say, a donor or to a city official who you want to give money to the museum. It's got to look good. So if you just scribble something, on a piece of notebook paper, that's not good enough. It has to look good. Now, if you're a skilled artist and drafts person who can draw really well, that's fine. But you got to make it look good. And finally, all sections are due on the time and date noted in the schedule. And you're going to get feedback from me as we go through in the various museum things. And if you just ignore my feedback, you will suffer a penalty to your grade. So it's important that you do take into account the critique I give earlier. So just keep that in mind.